This video examines Federalist number 73 by Alexander Hamilton. This is another one of Hamilton's papers that has to do with the powers of the presidency, particularly with the creating an energetic president. From his vision here, it's the provision for the support of the executive and the veto power. I've kind of titled it the qualified negative. I'm going to focus less here on presidential salary and more on the idea of why the president should have the ability to be able to veto legislation, which was very controversial, particularly for the Federalists who were concerned that the president would have too much power vis-a-vis the legislature or Congress. So essentially from Hamilton's viewpoint in Federalist number 73, it's the veto that will keep the president independent within our system of separation of powers in the United States and checks and balances. And it really is the fundamental check that the president has in order to be able to integrate himself into the legislative process. And while in earlier Federalist papers, there was a discussion about, why should one individual have this much power? From Hamilton's vantage point, it's really necessary because the legislature will naturally be the larger of the two branches with more power to overtake the president's, the rest of the branches as it has historically. So when we take a look here, basically we have a qualified veto, meaning that with a 2/3 override, the president is able to reject legislation from Congress, but Congress can then enact it into law. And Hamilton says, whether it's an absolute veto, as the King of England had, or whether it was a qualified veto, it was an absolute must for the president to be able to have to preserve separation of powers. And the first reason why, again, just to go back to other discussions in the Federalist Papers, is that the naturally stronger branch out of the three would be the legislature, which is why it was, divided up into two bicameral legislatures of the House and the Senate. Naturally, there was the belief that the legislature would be able to overtake the powers of the president. So to quote, directly from Hamilton in Federalist 73, he says, without, just taking a look here at the powers of the veto, he may gradually be stripped of his authorities by successive resolutions or annihilated by a single vote. And in the one mode or the other, the legislative and executive powers might speedily come to be blended in the same hands. So there's some, kind of serious worry here on behalf of Hamilton and the designers of the Constitution, that without giving the president the ability to be able to check Congress, that they would eventually kind of turn it into kind of a parliamentary system in which they took powers away from him. So in order to be able to create that keep the separation of powers, the veto was necessary. The second thing is in relationship to stopping bad legislation or things that were unconstitutional, the president would also need the veto in order to be able to prevent the legislature from passing policies that were not good. And one of these kind of controversies associated with that is, why should one individual have the power to be able to check what all of Congress has done on its own? And the question really that Hamilton raises here is, well, why do you necessarily think that the legislature is always going to be infallible? It may be closest to the people, but it may make the wrong decisions. And the president needs to be there as a bulwark in order to be able to protect people's constitutional rights. So as a consequence of that, basically saying that this is a good power for the president to have. Now, one of the problems is, what if the president uses this too much? What if the president injects himself too much into the process of the legislature? And here's where you really see kind of the inherent conservatism of the founders in the way that they designed government. And for the most part, they designed government to stop things from happening rather than to make them happen quickly. So just a quote here from Hamilton. People that are concerned about this, people really concerned about the president using the power to veto too much and stopping legislation, he said, they will consider every institution calculated to restrain the excess of lawmaking and to keep things in the same state in which they happen to be at any given point period as much more likely to do good than harm, because it is favorable to greater stability in the system of legislation. The injury which may possibly be done by defeating a few good laws will be amply compensated by the advantage of preventing a number of bad ones. So in other words, the finger on our system of government here is always to stop laws that may in some way take rights away from people, even if that means that some laws that may be in the public interest are not passed. And again, that goes into the entire structure of government and the reason why we have the entire separation of powers, why we have a Republican form of government, why we have checks and balances, why we have an extended republic, why we have federalism. So this is, in essence, not just a discussion about the president's power to veto, but also about the idea of how we prevent any one group from getting too much power in American politics.